East is east and west is west and never twain shall meet. With those thunderous words, Rudyard Kipling opened his Ballad of the East and West. And for many people quote that as an example of how racist he was. Although actually, a few lines later, it's clear what he's saying is that when two strong individuals come together, all that nonsense about birth, race, boundaries and everything is nothing. In fact, he was really arguing for a more individual experience, for me, a more magical view of the world than that religious, political tendency to put labels and classify things. Now, actually, he didn't say strong individual, he said strong men, so you can still call him a sexist if you want to. Now, but for many people, that is a strong idea, the East versus the West, the East-West conflict. And I can sympathise a bit because in England we have a north-south divide, and it's very straightforward. In the north, people keep whippets and they say "eh ba gum," and down in the south they keep Labradors and say "eh I say." Now, if you try to use that to find your way around Britain as a direction indicator, you would soon learn it's absolute rubbish. There's just so many exceptions, it's meaningless. Actually, it isn't absolute rubbish, because if you were more scientific about it, if you took 1 million people from the north of England, 1 million people from the south of England, you would probably I'm pretty sure you get a statistically significant greater number of "eh ba gums" in the north section and "oh I says" in the southern section. But as a practical working tool, direction finding, it's no use whatsoever. Now, the reason I was interested in this is because when I first showed my diagram to people, the fourfold diagram where I suggest that we've got 4 cultures, the artistic, religious, magical and scientific culture, people's response was often, so I see, yes, where does astrology lie? Is it on the science side or is it the magic side? Or where is philosophy on this diagram? And I began to realise that they're actually asking the wrong question. And I began to understand what's happening when I thought in terms of this, compared it with this. Where's Britain on this diagram? And of course it depends where you are. If you're in Cape Town, then Britain's right up the north. If you're in Oslo, Britain's down to the south, and so on. There's a different way of looking at it. It's not about 4 categories, although people try to make it so. It's about 4 directions. And another thing about this sort of diagram, it's a magical diagram for me because it subdivides. That's what I want to do yet. There is actually just as much art, religion and magic in the science section and just as much religion, science and magic in the arts section as in any other. Each section contains all the others. Now, if you're used to religious thinking where you like clear boundaries, Muslim or Christian, Catholic or Protestant, whatever, or scientific thinking where you like your boundaries to be well defined, people they say you can't work with that. It's crazy, a system where everything contains everything else. And yet, a lot of magical systems do that. If you take the simple thing of earth, air, fire and water, they are very distinct elemental qualities. And yet, if you look at the court cards of the tarot pack, something like Knight of Cups represents the fiery aspect of water. Each one subdivides into the 4 elements, and in theory you can keep on subdividing and subdividing and subdividing. And in astrology, each of the 12 signs, if you look at it from the point of view of the 12th harmonic, is in a sense a progression through the entire zodiac to completion. And in the Kabbalah, the tree of life, they say every sphere of the tree of life contains the whole tree. So magical categories are fractal in that sense. And we can deal with them. And again, I go back to this diagram. You can face the fact that Cape Town, which is a southern city, has actually got just as much north, south, east and west as any other city. Go to the Far East and you've still got north, south, east and west in equal quantities. When you start thinking in terms of directions rather than categories, there's no problem with working in this way. And it's been called right brain thinking, this directional sense, the spatial sense, as opposed to left brain thinking, which is in terms of categories. Now, in fact, actually, that's another of these binaries made out of what is a rather more complex continuum of ways of thinking. But it's a useful indicator. And you realize that if you start looking at things in terms of directions, continua, there's an awful lot of the sort of binary dilemmas in our society, which actually are an arbitrary split in a continuum. I said right brain, left brain. Well, there's an even less creditable political classification into right wing, left wing. Okay, it had some origin in where people sat after the Napoleonic, the French Revolution. But even then, people disputed it. But we use it as a convenient label, say, oh, he's a right wing, he's a left winger. Whereas, of course, it is actually a continuum. There's centre left and centre right and all that sort of thing. And in fact, you could be at one extreme, say you're an absolute fascist, total fascist, and you're thinking in terms of, how can we benefit the masses so we get their support? In other words, just thinking in a more sort of leftward way, even though you're right out on the right, extreme right, and so on. We classify people, we label them on what is actually a continuum. And I had an example of that when I came to South Africa, and I had to sign up, fill a lot of forms in order to become a resident of South Africa. And one of the forms asked me to tick a box of ethnicity or something, black, white, coloured, Malaysian, mixed race, Chinese or whatever. And I naively ticked mixed race because coming from England, I know on my father's side, they're pretty strongly Saxon. But my mother comes, her background is the far northern Isles of Scotland, sort of Pictish, Celtic type of mixture. And so I ticked mixed race, and I wasn't allowed to do that. To be admitted to South Africa, I had to tick the box white European. I was a bit cross about that because I said, well, I'm not white, look, this is white, look at me. My teeth aren't even white, let alone the whites of my eyes aren't that white. Okay, I've got white hair now, but I didn't then. I said, this is a nonsense classification. I've never seen a white person. I've been here many years in South Africa. I've never seen a black person here. All I've seen is many shades in between. And I was really glad when I went to the museum, the Cradle of Humankind, which is a wonderful sort of, it's bigger than a museum, it's a sort of day experience outside Johannesburg. And one of the many things they have is as you enter into the sort of inner museum part, there's a whole lot of sort of games you can play, and one of them has got this long strip of different shades, and it says hold the inside of your forearm up against this thing and see where you are along this scale. And okay, I was towards the pale end, but basically there was no white and no black there, but there was every shade of skin colour in between. It's a continuum. And yet the strange thing to me was that I was being asked to make an arbitrary decision that I was white. Now, how this arose, of course, it's the fault of those people, the first Europeans who came to South Africa, or came to Africa, and label themselves white and the others black, which in itself is not a stupid thing to do, because everyone does it. You know, when Europeans arrived in New Zealand, I'm told that and they said, what are you? And they said Maori, and that just means normal, you know, you're the weirdos, sort of thing. I think in Japan they have an expression like gaijin or something for round eyes, meaning Europeans or Western people. And actually the one I like was when people arrived in North America, the natives there called them pale faces. Now, I admit I am a pale face, just I'm not white. So what was a bit weird to me was that why post-Rainbow Nation the government was absolutely insisting on sticking to this arbitrary distinction that was made by colonializers all those centuries before. Why were they doing that? It just comes so naturally to people to make these splits, you know, north-south divide, east-west conflict, black-white, so on and so forth. And that does raise the question of why do they do it? Well, it's another story really, and I've referred to it elsewhere in my writing, but basically I think that it's absolutely fundamental to the left brain thinking process. And I illustrated this by saying to people, what's the simplest thing you can think of? And they tend to go towards, you know, blank empty space or nothingness or endless something or other. And what I point out is you can't really think about that. The mind keeps wanting to go to the edges, want to know when it began or what or what isn't there and things like that. Whereas if you give the mind a simple split, like black or white, manifest, unmanifest, just give the mind a split and it can play around on that sort of boundary forever. And so it seemed to me that a split was absolutely fundamental to the thinking process. And in fact, interestingly, a person called George Spencer Brown wrote a book called The Laws of Form, where he worked out a sort of really the ultimate elementary calculus, which is based simply on a split in nothingness. And of course, this is what Crowley's formula of naught equals 2 is all about. The idea that although we sort of think of things coming from a oneness, really there was a nothing that split into two-ness, and that's when manifestation began. Anyway, that's what makes, you can't just say, oh, let's transcend dualistic thinking, because it is the essence of thinking. It is what thinking is based on. And the analogy for me is you are looking at this on a screen, you're seeing colours, you're seeing movement, visuals. It's all very wonderful, but if you look deep, 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 deep down into the software, there's only zeros and ones there. The whole of computing is, what happens to those chips is basically there are two states of matter which are labelled on and off, and everything that builds up from there through more and more complex layers of software, what you see. So, as I say, we can't just get rid of this sort of binary way of looking at things, but it's good to realise the extent to which it is a construct of one way of thinking, and there is this other way of thinking, this directional way of thinking, which sees things as continua. And as I point out in this book, when you start thinking continua, you're in a vastly bigger universe. That science tends to need to quantize things. You know, what is the smallest unit of measurement we can make? And as soon as you break things into pixels like that, you've reduced them, even if they're infinite, into a countable infinity. Whereas in 1 inch line, in terms of directions, there's an uncountable infinite number of points on that line. In other words, there are more points on that line than there are particles in the entire infinite universe. So this is my second of my sort of ways of coping with these awful good-evil binary dilemmas which are thrust upon us. And it is to realize that in most cases you can actually see, if you look from a directional point of view, that you're being condemned to one side or the other of what actually is a continuum of shades. And it means that if you're not condemned, you can actually take steps in a certain direction. So, for example, let's take someone, the depths of evil, you know, a crazed psychopathic mass murderer. He's labelled absolute evil. He hasn't got a hope. But as an individual, he might still have some standards of his own. In other words, faced with the possibility of killing some children, possibly he might say, I love killing people, but I can't do it to these children. And that hasn't got him out of being an evil, crazy murderer, but he's actually looking in the direction that we would call good. He's taking a step in that way. And it can work the other way. You know, you may become elected into some religious movement. You know, you're the chosen ones, you're the good, and you're up against the evil of the world. And because you know you're good and everything, you feel you can't make a step wrong. And then you find one of your acolytes has done something a bit shady, you know, perhaps not being quite honest about where the collection money went or something. And but you are this person so good, you can forgive anything, and you know that it's God's best to do that, and you let them get away with it. Well, you're still one of the blessed ones, but you've taken a step in the direction of allowing evil and corruption into the movement by letting people get away with that. So it's just that there is this other way you can look at some of these problems of good and evil, and you can see that even though it looks hopeless, you know, you're really in the shit, there's still the direction towards good, and you can take steps that way. And so this I call my analogue model for trying to deal with good and evil. And in the last video of this series, I'll look at my other approach, which is the Trinitarian approach.